The summer of 2005, Hurricane Katrina swept through the Gulf Coast, leaving over $100 billion in damages. No disaster in the USA has ever been so costly to fix. It was said that Katrina began to brew over the Bahamas and eventually it would make its way to the Gulf Coast, but by this time it was already too late to take action. It hit during the early hours of the morning, which caught many by surprise and left towns such as New Orleans in pure chaos. It was when heavy rainfall caused levees and banks to burst and left towns flooded with many stranded on rooftops waiting to be rescued. Alabama, Mississippi and Louisiana were affected tremendously. Many residents were to lose their homes as well as livelihoods. It is worth noting that New Orleans is not new to this type of disaster. Since records were kept, New Orleans has had seen 5 floods within a 200-year period. So maybe it shouldn't have come as a surprise, and begs to ask the question, why weren't they ready for such an event? When we look at the geography of New Orleans, it is considered a coastal town, and it borders very closely to the Gulf Coast. This is why it took the brunt of the storm, especially when we consider parts of the city are below sea level or at sea level. The areas of the town that were damaged most were places of a lower socio-economic background, with limited resources and most living under the poverty line, as John Logan of Brown University states. The data for the total region show that in several respects, the neighbourhoods of social groups with least resources were the ones affected by Katrina. In white neighbourhoods, the damage was also bad. However, they were better equipped to deal with the situation and bounce back. Not to mention that many are insured and therefore have the financial support to get back on their feet, unlike the poorer communities that can't afford to take out insurance on houses, therefore widening the gap even further between rich and poor. There were systematic problems that led to further devastation that should have been dealt with differently. Firstly, the US Army Corps engineers should have provided better flood protection, and it is questionable that the methods and construction in place weren't adequate enough following budget cuts. The levees in place were out of date and were in need of an upgrade, as the flood walls that were in place were insufficient in holding back even moderate surges.
But by 8 a.m., there are reports that a levee has broken. The waters of Lake Pontchartrain rush in. Levees in 3 locations are breached. 80% of the city is flooded. Some neighborhoods are submerged under 20 feet of water.
An East Jefferson Levee District contract from 1992 that shows the only true picture of what dredging work from 1990 did to the bottom of the canal. And what it shows is devastating.
It shows that the side was eroded like Mr. Chatry had anticipated. And that erosion of taking a channel, bank, and the levee took away all the material that was needed to hold the pollards in place. And when the pollards didn't have nothing to hold them, they collapsed.
The fact that nobody had checked for erosion was one of the most shocking revelations after Katrina. It came up at this U.S. Senate hearing in December 2005.
Am I hearing that we do not have the capacity to determine whether the kind of structural damage that was occurring over a period of time could have been identified and then prevented? Colonel?
Senator, I believe that, from a visual, we typically do visual inspections. I don't know of any physical inspections that the levee district or the Corps does post-construction.
1992, when Jefferson Parish belatedly decided to finally join the dredging project. Look at all the supporting levee material they removed on the Orleans side in 1990. And then this. The red line is the slope of the levee that should have been dredged. And this is how much it went beyond that line in just 2 years.
Media outlets like the New York Times believe that it was the preparations that were so detrimental. Robertson and Schwartz from the New York Times tell us, once the flood walls were chosen, its engineers failed to notice some critical warning signs in their studies, with disastrous results. There was a choice between high levee walls and gates that controlled flow, but the Army Corps chose the flood walls, and now the Army Corps are suffering from the repercussions, and many put the blame down to them. Since then, the Army Corps have built a $14 billion hurricane system, which shows what maybe was missing when the hurricane did strike. Looking back at the catastrophe in retrospect, we can clearly see there was a deep underlying issue that wasn't addressed, and priorities lay elsewhere. We know that the catastrophe cannot be prevented, but the devastation that followed could have been. By preparing for the flooding correctly, many lives could have been saved as well as billions in repair costs. The levees that were implemented were not what the Army Corps suggested originally. However, they were put in place due to orders given from local authority. A water gate should have been put in place to control the surges and moderate water flow. There is no control over the velocity and quantity it can reach. The heavy rainfall led to overwhelming surge levels that eventually burst the levee that protected the lower side of the city. The construction that was put in place was inadequate and out of date and was in need of some repair work. The ones who suffered most greatly were the lower class that were housed in the low-lying areas with limited resources. The consequences of poor preparation meant up to 100,000 houses lost, with whole communities wiped off the map. The cost of the catastrophe has been a huge drain financially, especially when we take into consideration the new $14 billion hurricane defense system that was put in place. It is clear that officials didn't deliver quickly or professionally enough, and there was a lack of initiative. There has to be a protocol in place for when there are events like this, because there should be no room for incompetency. Not when people's lives are at stake. Not only was the response so ineffective, but the construction ordered in place was not sufficient. However, they claimed they were just following orders. These orders came from local officials that chose the inferior walls over gates. If there were to be another hurricane today, it would be dealt with much more efficiently and promptly. With social media communication of today and the lessons learned from the last occasion, I have no doubt it would be handled with much more control. In addition, there was a lack of initiative from people on all levels. Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco failed to submit a request for help in a timely manner. The request to the White House for evacuation transport efforts wasn't requested. It's because of this that vulnerable people were left with no way of escaping the flooding zones. Many elderly and young and poor left with no assistance. This includes 90 findings of failures at all levels of government, according to a senior investigation staffer. This was called a failure of initiative. Lawrence Mazzano from the Salem Press Encyclopedia points out, political bodies often place development interest ahead of flood protection, which clearly indicates that interests were placed in the wrong area. Subsequently, the old levee systems became ineffective for the city. The hurricane was truly humbling.
I'm lost. That's all I had. That's all I had. As long as what I'm gonna do.